Welcome to my 14th lecture on this series on Middle East politics. I'm Dr. Bufano. In today's lecture, we're going to talk about Zionism and Palestine. Now, this is an incredibly controversial issue, right? And it's one of the most polarizing issues to talk about when you're going into the Middle East. It is understandable that after watching this video, you might disagree with some of the interpretations of what Zionism is or how it's impacted the region, and that's fine. Feel free to leave a comment below. I like having discussions on these issues. Keep in mind as well that the lecture I'm about to give is based on my reading of academic resources as well as my travels throughout the region. So let's get to it. In fact, this whole next unit is going to be on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? If you haven't watched my prior units on Middle East politics, I highly recommend doing so. What we're going to be discussing over the next 5 lectures is Israel and Palestine and how it's impacted the region. Now, it might seem a little strange doing an entire unit on what are essentially, just 2 countries, right? But this is a conflict that has impacted the entire region. Okay, it's going to lead to a series of international wars. It's going to cause civil wars in neighboring countries. It's going to, of course, involve conflict within Israel and Palestine. And the discourse surrounding it is going to become incredibly important, not only for the Middle East, but for the rest of the globe. And of course, it has a great impact on US foreign policy, as well as the foreign policies of many other countries throughout the globe. It is so intertied in so many of the issues facing the Middle East today that requires extensive discussion. It also requires as well, I think, a very even hand, the use of statistics and evidence. And, it really requires as well, I think, a tolerance for a difference of opinion here. So it's okay to have different perspectives on this conflict. I'm going to try to treat it as delicately as I can. Tens of thousands of people have been killed as a result of this conflict. So it really should be handled in a way that is sensitive. So let's get to it. This first lecture is going to introduce to you about where this conflict started. Now, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict does not go back 1,000 years or 2,000 years or 3,000 or whatever. This is often the discourse you will hear in much of the media. The reality is it goes back to the 1920s. Okay, that's when this conflict started. And it all starts with the migration of people who are known as Zionists to Palestine. So in order to understand the beginnings of this conflict, we have to understand what is Zionism and what drove it. And so we're going to talk about what Zionism is, what anti-Semitism is, how this movement emerged within Jewish communities within Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, and how it inspired tens of thousands of people to migrate to Palestine, which at the time was a British mandate after World War I. And so we're going to understand why Jewish people colonized Palestine. What was the driving factors that led them there, the controversy surrounding it, and how the British were also involved in this process with something called the Balfour Declaration. And we're also going to understand as well the Arab-Muslim response. See, the problem was that Palestine was occupied mainly by Arab Muslims who had spent several centuries living under this Turkish Ottoman Empire. They had no choice in terms of the migration of these individuals to Palestine. This was a decision made by the British. And it's also as well as something that was mostly rejected by the Arab Muslim local elites when it started to happen. And it led to the emergence of Palestinian nationalism. So we're going to talk about where this identity comes from. So this is a modern conflict. So of course, there is a past history of tensions between Jews and Muslims in different parts of the world, but the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is something that is modern. It comes from the 1920s. Now, just to kind of review what we discussed in a previous lecture on the people of the book, the different monotheistic minorities in the Middle East and North Africa, the Jewish peoples, they eventually, after the Romans destroyed the second Jewish temple in Jerusalem, the Temple of Solomon, after they destroyed it, the Jewish communities that were in Jerusalem then went into exile, right? This is what's called the second Jewish diaspora. They traveled to different parts of the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. And these Jews lived as minorities in different parts of the region, first under Roman rule and then later in successive empires. So, for the most part, they usually lived in cities, often as merchants, artisans, because this was an exile community. They tended to specialize in trade. They had a lot of long distance contacts. They engaged in things like money lending. And because of the political oppression they faced from both Christians and later Muslims in these parts of the world, they weren't usually allowed to enter the highest ranks of the political administration. They were often prevented from owning land. They were often prevented from joining the military. And so they ended up becoming ghettoized in these different parts of the Middle East and North Africa. And because the Jews did not emphasize missionary activity, they never developed a kind of a mass base of support in the same ways that Christians and Muslims would. So for 2,000 years after the Roman destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem and the second exile, Jews lived scattered throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Now, of course, the Jewish relationship with Christians and Muslims has always varied. It's ranged from relative tolerance and being treated as a second-class citizen to outright direct prejudice and sometimes physical violence, leading to what are called pogroms. These are, when mobs attack Jewish communities. And so this has always existed. But it became much worse, these discriminatory attitudes towards Jewish peoples in the late 19th century, due to the emergence of systematic racial discrimination, social Darwinist rhetoric, fascism. During the late 19th century, we see the emergence in Europe of these nationalist movements that oftentimes were not very tolerant of minorities. And this leads to something called anti-Semitism. This was the belief that Jews were an inferior race. Now, notice how I'm not saying here an inferior religion. I'm saying an inferior race. Social Darwinists believed that there was no separation between race and culture, and they believed that religious minorities like Jews were a separate race from other groups. Now, of course, being Jewish is not a race. It's a religion, right? It has nothing to do with phenotype or skin color. Social Darwinism is a pseudoscience. But this was widely believed in many far-right circles in Europe, particularly amongst fascists in Nazi Germany, for example, and under Mussolini in Italy. So anti-Semitism became rife in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so it grew during this time period. And what starts to happen is that the violence starts to ratchet up against Jewish communities, first in Europe, and then a little later in the Middle East and North Africa, under the Ottoman Empire and in the aftermath. So this was a time when there was a lot of religious and ethnic violence, not just against Jewish peoples, but against all sorts of other faiths and ethnicities. So very violent time in human history here that's going to culminate with two really terrible world wars. So this was tied to the spread of social Darwinism and ethnic nationalism in a really intricate way. And as a consequence, it's going to lead to some very well-known episodes of mass violence committed against Jews. Some of the most famous incidents first took place in Russia under the Tsarist monarchy from the late 19th to the early 20th century, where many Jewish peoples were attacked. So if you've ever seen Fiddler on the Roof, for example, this is kind of part of the narrative in that story, right? So many of the Jews in that story were forced out of their villages, right? It led to these pogroms, mass violence against the Jewish minority in this country. And it didn't stop there, right? It spread to many other countries. And the worst of it took place during this 12-year episode known as the Holocaust, which lasted from 1933 to 1945, where Jews in Germany and then elsewhere in Europe, after Germany conquered most of the continent, were first they were first discriminated against in mass. They were stripped of their citizenship. Then they were sent to ghettos, and then finally to concentration camps, and some to execution camps, right? To places like Auschwitz, for example, and Dachau. Millions of Jews were killed. Over 6 million were killed in Europe. And on top of that, during this war, Germany invaded France, and they found these collaborators in France, these fascist collaborators that they propped up in the government. It was known as the Vichy regime, and the Vichy regime took over many of the colonies in the Middle East and North Africa and engaged in a lot of discrimination against Jews there in places like Morocco, in Algeria, and Tunisia. So the discrimination against Jews during this era was really widespread. And eventually, this is going to influence the Middle East as well. You're going to see pogroms and violence break out. So in Algeria, in the city of Constantine, you're going to see the breakout of mass violence against Jews, the burning of Jewish shops, destruction of synagogues. So a lot of terrifying violence here. In Syria in 1947, for example, there was mass violence committed against Jewish peoples. So just throughout the region, and in fact, this is going to cause the mass migration of Jews from these places. If you go to Egypt today, you will find in Cairo a very nice synagogue that sits in the middle of the downtown area. And there used to be a vibrant Jewish community in Egypt. No longer. The Jews have fled that country, along with countries like Tunisia, like Syria. Almost no Jews remain because of this mass violence. And of course, millions of Jews are going to flee Europe as well. And as I said, Morocco as well, right? Morocco, another country that experienced mass violence against Jews in 1948. And so what spread during this era were these kind of anti-Semitic tropes, right? Denigrating Jews as being monsters, as being unethical, as being cruel, as being these kind of voracious moneylenders who took advantage of people, as being greedy. So you had a lot of these stereotypes that emerged due to this discrimination. And so if you take a look at this political cartoon here, we see here it's, addressing anti-Semitism. And so this idea, right, that Jews are stealing money out of the pockets of poor Christian children is kind of an old trope. And the kind of irony of this idea of Jews being these voracious moneylenders is that it was actually discrimination against Jews that forced them into these type of professions. Because before the coming of the modern world, being a merchant or a moneylender was not a high profile, political position, right? It wasn't something that was in a high social class. Before the coming of the modern world, it's land ownership that gave you power. And so, the irony here is that Jews were forced into these professions, and thus they get stereotyped on this basis. And you can see here this, stereotypical image of the Jew with the physical appearance. As I said, social Darwinism saw Jews as being a separate race, right? So you have all these stereotypical physical features that don't exist with every Jewish person. So, this is part of the stereotypes that were really dominant during this era in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so, as a result of this, the Jews that lived in Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa began to debate how to respond to the increase in discrimination against their people. And really, to simplify a complex situation, there were three major trends here. Three major intellectual currents that are going to emerge amongst the Jewish elites within their communities. Now, the first group of people were those that wanted to stick to tradition. What we know as Orthodox Jews, traditionalists, those who wanted to keep the manner of dress that they had been accustomed to, their dietary habits, that wanted to keep to their professions that they were used to, that wanted to keep their community closed off. So Judaism had a tendency to be a kind of closed off community, right? They didn't go out and engage in missionary work. They didn't go out and try to rock the boat, so to speak, right? So they wanted to stay closed off. They wanted to keep to their traditions. And, for response to a lot of the suffering they were experiencing, there was kind of this kind of fatalism with old school Judaism that you also find in other faiths where, suffering is just a part of life, right? It's God's punishment for sin, right? And, that they'll eventually, reach their Zion, their new kingdom in the afterlife, right? Or the coming of the end of days. So for Orthodox Jews, it was basically take the discrimination in good faith, right? So they opposed reforms and they wanted to keep their community closed off to retain their traditions. But not all Jews felt this way. Just like in other communities in the Islamic and Christian world, the 1800s was a time of industrialization, mass education, and modernization. And you see the emergence of a new Jewish middle class, some of whom had gone to European universities, studied with people who were Christians or Muslims. And this new middle class was beginning to promote liberal reforms. Many of these individuals wanted to assimilate into the modern world, to change their dress and their diet, to try to become more like other Europeans, to start to adopt new professions. But they wanted to do so in the framework of assimilating into these societies. They didn't want to go off and leave their countries. Instead, they wanted to, other than promote assimilation, promote changes in their government so that they can, promote democracy, promote equality between religions, and promote secularism. So these individuals promoted democracy and left-wing kind of stances where they lobbied their governments to respect the rights of Jews, right, and to promote tolerance, as well as to keep religion out of politics so that Jews weren't victims of mass discrimination or pogroms. So they wanted to become integrated within their societies, these reformist Jews or these liberal Jews, right? So this was a reformist movement, one that sought integration. So very different from the Orthodox perspective here, which is more about being closed off, sticking to tradition. That was also more authoritarian in nature. So, and some of these Reform Jews as well would also later be inspired by Marxist currents, the far left, and, things like socioeconomic redistribution of wealth and so on and so forth. So there were different currents of Reform Judaism. But you see the emergence of this left wing here, right? They're promoting assimilation. Now, at first, Reform Judaism had a lot of support, but because of increased violence against Jewish peoples, increasing support for a third option became more prominent. And this third option is known as Zionism. Zionists promoted the idea that Jews would never be able to assimilate into European or Muslim societies. There was too much discrimination. The emergence of nationalism made it impossible. And they felt like in order to save Judaism, they had to create their own states, that they would not survive without a state of their own. Now, an important thing to understand about the founding Zionists is they were not right-wing. These were not religious zealots. They were actually left-wing, some of them very far left-wing. In fact, there were some communists amongst their midst. They were influenced by reformist ideas, right? They were all about modernization, these early Zionists. They were all about secularism as well. So initially, at least, Zionism was a left-wing movement. But they believed Jews would never be accepted in Christian Muslim nations. It was no use trying to assimilate because they would just be rejected, right? And they point to the long history of pogroms and systematic discrimination against Jews in both the Middle East and in Europe as a reason for this. And so this was an intense debate within the Jewish community, as well as between Jews and other ethnic groups in Europe, right, about what to do about the future here. So there was also a debate within Zionism about where to establish this state. Now, the term Zion itself, so where does this term come from? In Jewish tradition, it is a place of refuge for the oppressed, okay? So it is, for example, where the prophet Moses led his people out of oppression in Egypt to the promised land, okay, to where Palestine and Israel are now located, right, to Jerusalem, the holy center of the ancient Israeli kingdoms. So Zion, it's a place of refuge. And so what were these Zionists looking for? They were looking for a place of refuge for the Jewish people to establish their own states. And one of the intellectual founders of this movement was a Jew from Central Europe named Theodor Herzl, well-educated, leftist intellectual. And in 1897, him and another large group of activists, backed with the wealth of a lot of wealthy merchants and bankers and so on and so forth, just like other social movement organizations, right? They find the World Zionist Organization with the goal of trying to go around the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe to Jewish communities to promote this idea, to encourage migration to Palestine and to convince Europeans, as well as the Ottoman Empire at the time, to allow this migration. Now, initially, and this is important to keep in mind here, they had not agreed on where to migrate to. So I'm going to get into that in a second. So while Palestine was the final outcome, there was actually a bit of a debate about where they would go initially. Now, Herzl himself was an intellectual. He wrote a lot of pamphlets and he wrote a lot of essays, one of the most famous of which is Der Judenstaat, which is the Jewish states, okay? So he writes this pamphlet in 1896 promoting this idea before this organization was created, and it gains in popularity and it gains momentum in Jewish communities, especially as the violence ratcheted up against this community. Now, they did initially, as I said, debate where to seek refuge. You know, there were some ideas about maybe going to Uganda, for example. There were some debates about whether or not they should go to Argentina or Madagascar. There were lots of ideas thrown around. But eventually, they decided on Palestine. Okay, and a big reason for this has to do with the fact that, of course, this is where the first ancient Israeli kingdom was established. It's Jerusalem's the holiest site for Jews. And while the leftists didn't care much about the religious aspect of Judaism, they considered themselves more culturally Jewish. They felt that it would be a good kind of marketing strategy, right? So eventually Palestine was decided upon because they wanted to be able to convince the Jewish community en masse to migrate to a place. And so for those Jews who are more conservative and religious, they were hoping to use that as a kind of way to pull them to Palestine. So as you can see here, Zionism started as a social movement, just like Islamism and liberalism and Arab nationalism and Turkish nationalism in the Middle East. So Zionism, it's a social movement. They engaged in protests. They lobbied government officials. They established educational institutions. They sent aid and support to Jewish communities throughout the region. So very active movements. Okay. And so here's Theodor Herzl here. Notice here the Western style clothing, right? The, try to present himself as this kind of reformist, this modernist here. And he was also very charismatic in nature. He's someone who was able to whip up a lot of support within Jewish communities throughout the region. And so they lobbied various governments to help them out, but it's not until World War I that they would have success, okay? So the Zionists, they decide on Palestine as the new homeland, and they begin to lobby heavily the British and French to make this happen, right? So Palestine, the location of the ancient Jewish kingdom of Israel, is where they decide upon. Keep in mind, by this point in history, there were very few Jews living in Palestine. The vast majority were Arab Muslims with a small Christian Arab population there. Less than 1% actually of Palestine consisted of Jews at this time. But they decide on Palestine because of its religious significance and historical significance for the Jewish community, right? It contains the holy city of Jerusalem. So they eventually convince the British to support them in this plan. Now, here's why. In 1914, the British declared war on the Ottoman Empire, and eventually they were looking for all sorts of allies to help them out. Remember, they recruited the Arabs, the Sharif Hussein of Mecca and Medina. We talked about this in a separate lecture, how they recruited them to go help fight in this conflict. Okay, but they were also looking for the support of other groups, including various groups within Europe to help support their cause, including Jewish peoples. Now, at the time, during the war, as you learned in a previous lecture, there were debates about what to do with the Arab lands of the Ottoman Empire if the Ottoman Empire were to be defeated, including on what to do with this area called Palestine. Now, if you remember from a previous lecture, we talked about how during the Sikes-Picot debates, there was this kind of idea thrown around that Palestine, along with the major city there, Jerusalem, would be ruled by this international coalition between the Russians, the French, and British. This never happened because the Russians dropped out of the war, and then eventually the San Remo Agreement kind of did away with this idea. Palestine became a British mandate by the end of the war. So eventually, what the British decided to do in order to gather more support from the war, specifically Jewish support, they decided to promise the Zionist Federation and the elites that supported it that, hey, if they donated to the war cause, if they supported the war against the Ottoman Empire and against Germany, they would then be rewarded. And what would that reward be? It would be that Jews would be able to establish a homeland in Palestine. They would be able to move there. And this was written out in something called the Balfour Declaration. It was written by a British foreign secretary. His name was Arthur Balfour. And so essentially, he wrote this up to try to win over Jewish support for the war. So it was a promise, okay? Promise that if you support our cause, we'll allow you to migrate to Palestine. And so this was passed in 1917. Now, what is the big problem with this? Well, obviously, for the Jews who supported it, right, the Zionists, they love this, right? It's an opportunity to flee violence, an opportunity to form potentially in the long-term future a new state, even though this is not what the British promised them. They only promised that they could move there. But the problem with it was that the Arabs had no input into this. None of the Arabs had a say in the Balfour Declaration, in much the same ways they did not have a say with the Sikes-Picot or San Remo agreement. So the drawing up of the borders of the former lands of the Ottoman Empire, former Arab lands of the Ottoman Empire. So as a consequence of this, there was mass anger in the Arab world. Once news became public of this Balfour Declaration, there was mass anger across the Arab world. They felt betrayed in much the same way as they felt betrayed by the Sikes-Picot Agreement when the French and British went behind the backs of the Arabs to agree on how to divide up the Middle East amongst themselves. Okay? And of course, the other massive problem here is that Palestine was populated mainly by Arab Muslims in 1917. There were very few Jews left. So remember, this area hadn't been a Jewish kingdom for over 2,000 years, right? So the Jews had been sent into exile during the Roman era, and most of them had fled Jerusalem and the surrounding area. So this was a return of the Jews to the region. That's why this is a modern conflict, by the way, very important to point out. So furthermore, another big issue, Jerusalem is not just important to Jewish peoples, it's important to Muslims and Christians. It's the third most holy city in Islam. Go watch a previous lecture to find out why that's the case. It's important for Christians. It's the place of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. It's not just important to Judaism. It's important to these other faiths. And so this is going to create all sorts of problems here. So let's just look at the Balfour Declaration just to see what was promised to the Jewish communities here. Here it is. So, dear Lord Rothschild, and by the way, Lord Rothschild was a very wealthy Jewish activist that also, donated a lot to the Zionist Federation. So he was British, and thus the British government wanted to win over support of himself and other activists. So here Balfour writes, I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy within Jewish Zionist aspirations, which have been submitted to and approved by the cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this objective. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So basically, it's promising Jews a homeland, but not a state of their own, right? So you can go to this place, but you can't, this does not mean we are going to displace other groups that live there, Christians or Muslims, right? So you could go and live there, but we're not promising you your own state here. So the Balfour Declaration did not create Israel. This is going to come later, a couple decades later, okay? So he finishes here, I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation, which of course Lord Rothschild does. And, and of course, the British are going to be able to fulfill their promise because the British and French are going to conquer most of the Ottoman Empire. They're going to carve up the Arab lands amongst themselves. You learned about this in a previous lecture. And so one of the provinces that gets created is this new province of Palestine. Now, it was part of this province called Greater Syria under the Ottoman Empire. What is now Palestine was just a sub-province within the Ottoman lands. The term Palestine itself comes from the name Philistine, a name from the Bible, right? There was this group called the Philistine that lived near the ancient Jewish kingdom of Israel. And it was also the name of a Roman province as well. And so the British create this new colony, this mandate that they rule over, and they allow, Jews to migrate to it. So they create Palestine here on a map, and thus it becomes a colony. And in the aftermath, this is when Jews begin to migrate. Now, you see, back in 1918, if you look at this chart, there were very few Jews. So there were less than a couple of thousand. You see on the chart here with all the numbers. Okay, then we see by the time we get to the end of World War II, so this is, when the Holocaust is happening, and we have over 400,000 migrants that come to Palestine. So within a span of a couple of decades, hundreds of thousands of Jews migrate from Europe, escaping political oppression and massacres. So this is going to have a dramatic effect on this place because many of these Jews are going to come there. Many of them are going to buy up land. They're going to get organized politically. It's going to lead to conflicts, and it's going to lead to violence between the Palestinians who live there, the indigenous people, and these new settlers that come there. So this is part of settler colonialism here. A big difference with the French, though, is that unlike French settler colonialism, you have Jews migrating from all over the region. They weren't just British citizens, and many people, were forced to flee because of the Holocaust and other mass violence. So throughout World War II, over 6 million Jews were killed. These are just looking at the different extermination camps and the different ghettos, as well as the different work camps that were set up. And, of course, we see that throughout Europe, Jews were rounded up and massacred, and many had to flee if they wanted to avoid this. And so, unfortunately, for many of these Jews, they had little options about where to migrate to. And so, even those who weren't pure Zionists felt they had no choice but to come to Palestine. But of course, there was a group of people that lived there that had no choice about this migration. These group of people are going to develop a sense as a consequence of a Palestinian identity. Thousands of Jews migrated to Palestine after World War I. And when they started to come, several things happened that are going to lead to conflict. Number one, a lot of these Jews were relatively wealthy, upper middle class, and they were wealthier than most of the Palestinians. Many rural farmers were relatively poor, didn't have much in the way of wealth. The Jews that came there, they had better technology, more wealth. They were often able to outcompete Palestinians, buy up land. And as their numbers grew, this led to growing tension with Palestinians as they began to lose their land and their control. And then this led to skirmishes, conflict, political mobilization, and from there, violence. Right. So we start to see the massive loss of land, and this is going to lead to grievances amongst the population. So this conflict, by the way, it's not just about religion. Jews have been living side by side with Muslims since pretty much the foundations of Islam, but hasn't always been conflict between Muslims and Jews in terms of outright violence. Certainly, there's been acts of discrimination and whatnot. It takes more than just having religious diversity to have violence. There was a socioeconomic element to this, one in which you had a lot of Jewish colonizers come there, eat up a lot of land, and the Arabs had no say in this, right? They were being ruled by a British mandate. So this was a part of colonialism. And so as a consequence of this, within this Palestinian community, much like in the other mandates, right, we begin to see these anti-British, anti-Western, and anti-Semitic attitudes spread, not only within Palestine, but other parts of the region that were looking at this and were horrified, right? This is one of the holiest lands for Islam. The third most holy important city was located at the center of this territory. And so Palestinian urban elites, what they're going to do is they're going to form a nationalist movement in opposition to this. Now, some of them were inspired by Arab nationalism, and they're going to try to make alliances with other Arabs. Others promoted just a Palestinian sense of identity, this idea that there was a Palestinian nation. And, of course, there were ties to land and villages long before the 1920s. Palestinian identity had existed, but nationalism is a modern form of identity, right? So we see with the emergence of socioeconomic development and the Tanzimat reforms in the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century, the emergence of newspapers and social movement activity. This is going to lead to the emergence of nationalist sentiment in the Middle East. And Palestinian national identity emerged in the 1920s. Okay, so it emerges in response to the creation of the British mandates and Jewish migration here. And so, in order to resist this, across this new mandate, Palestinians mobilized, and they create what's called the Palestinian Arab Congress in 1919. And just a year later, they're going to engage in mass protests. There's going to be riots against this in opposition to it. And this violence is going to get worse over time. And you're going to start to see as well the formation of, radical activists who are going to push back against Jewish settlement and the appropriation of land. One of these activists came from a family known as the al-Husseini family, and he formed the Palestinian Arab Party in 1935 as a way to try to lobby the British government and other Arab states to try to resist Jewish colonization. And just like other social movement activists elsewhere, they founded newspapers, clubs, and other associations, right? They're going to engage in mass protests, all sorts of social movement activity to oppose this. And on top of this as well, things are also going to get violent. They're going to start to engage in armed conflict. So, for example, in 1935, an organization called the Black Hand Gang is going to form, and they're going to commit acts of violence against Jewish settlers. There's going to be acts of terrorism committed. And of course, as I'm going to discuss in a second, you also had a similar thing happening on the Zionist side here as well, the Jewish side of the equation. Now, the British, in order to deal with this increasing violence, they oftentimes put it down with coercion, with force, but they also tried to co-opt some Muslims. So they ended up creating the Supreme Muslim Council to give the Muslim communities of Palestine some autonomy over local affairs. This was typical during the mandated period. The British were supposed to get these people ready for independence, right? So they create the Supreme Muslim Council here. And this Muslim council was headed by someone named Haj Amin from 1921 to 1937. And he's going to become a prominent activist that's going to try to lead the way towards not only independence for Palestine, but he's going to try to stop immigration from the rest of the region by Jews. And so here, one of the big leaders here was Amin al-Husseini, who founded that party in 1935, that Palestinian party. He was an important religious leader, and he came from more of an Islamist perspective. He was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. So this is a very important religious position. So he was part of the ulama. He was a religious scholar. And he was an activist that was anti-Zionist. He was deeply anti-Semitic. And he wanted to prevent the establishment of an Israeli state. And so he also promoted a Palestinian sense of identity. And we see the same thing happening on the Israeli side here as well, right? So we see a sense of Israeli nationalism emerge. When the Jewish people started to go into Palestine, these activists formed something called the Jewish National Fund. Rich Jews started to help poor Jews buy up land. They had this kind of fund set up where you can borrow money from it, or you could get aid from it, and in return, you could then buy land from the Palestinians. And so this was established from the 1920s and 30s. A lot of land was brought up, and in fact, part of the Palestinian activism during this time period was try to engage in collective action to convince Palestinians to not sell your land at all costs. You had a lot of poor Palestinians that would sell their land, they would migrate to cities. So a lot of the Palestinian nationalism was to try to boycott this and prevent this. A lot of these Jews as well began to set up their own kind of separate communities, walling themselves off from the Palestinians. As I said, a lot of these activists were actually far left. Many of them created what's called kibbutzes. These were these kind of utopian agricultural communities where farmers would live in these big collectives. A lot of Zionists wanted to move away from just the traditional activities of merchant activity, money lending. They wanted to become landowners. They wanted to become bureaucrats and become politically powerful, serve in militaries. One of the things they did was create these utopian agricultural communities where they started getting into the agricultural sciences. They had these kind of collective farms modeled off of collectivization in the Soviet Union, for example. So they started forming these kind of quote unquote utopian agricultural communities. And on top of this as well, they created their own council to run Jewish affairs. So just as Muslims had their own autonomy here, the British allowed, the Jews are going to have their own autonomy. We called it the Jewish National Council. It was created to run Jewish political affairs in 1920. So while it was run as one colony, the British here are, they're creating all sorts of issues, right? They're basically creating two separate communities with two separate identities and political systems that had great disparities in economic wealth here. And it consisted, by the way, this Jewish council of a legislature and a bureaucracy. It's going to lead to the future foundation of Israel later becoming a democracy after 1948. So they had a legislature, they're setting up bureaucracies, they're running a government, right? That's part of the point of this migration. The Zionists want to set up their own future states. And this went against the Balfour Declaration here. And on top of this as well, they begin for these communities to, with the Jewish National Fund and collecting taxes, they begin to establish universities and schools, security services. So they begin to build the basis of what's going to become the Israeli military, and infrastructure, new roads and bridges, as well as social welfare programs. So they create a government here, essentially. And on top of this, because it was a nationalist movement, and you had Jews that were coming from all over Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa that spoke different languages, they decided to revive this dead language that was, was a sacred religious language, but it was a dead spoken language, Hebrew. So just like you get modern standard Arabic that gets created right during this era, we see these scholars try to revive the Hebrew language. They create this standardized spoken and written Hebrew language. They promote it. They teach it in schools. And today, most of the people that are in Israel now speak Hebrew as a consequence of this. And by the way, Hebrew is a Semitic language. It's got a lot in common with Arabic. So the word for salem in Arabic is shalom in Hebrew. So a lot of similarities with Semitic languages. They all have three-letter root words. Now, these Jewish migrants as well, they formed social movements to promote nationalism. Just like the Palestinians, they create newspapers and civil society organizations, heavily promoting Zionist rhetoric. And so what emerges is an Israeli national identity. And you see this kind of promotion of independence. They want a creation of a separate Israeli state. And they want the British to give them that independence. And of course, they were very much opposed by the Palestinians. Now, the leader eventually of this movement that's going to emerge is a young man named David Ben-Gurion, who himself was a migrant who left Europe, came to Israel, is going to eventually become a activist within the Zionist movement, and he's going to become a nationalist leader. He was left wing. He's going to become part of something called the Labor Party, and very much promoted Israeli nationalism. In fact, he's often known as one of the founding fathers of the Israeli state. So, very important movement leader here. And of course, eventually what's going to happen is that violence is going to break out between these communities. It's going to start as small skirmishes, protests, riots, and then eventually it's going to break out into a full-scale civil war by 1936. This is known as the Great Arab Revolt, the first major conflict here that took place, although it had been preceded by 2 decades of increasing escalation. So the political climate in Palestine really took a turn for the worst after 1929. Now, why is this the case? Well, number one, the Great Depression. In fact, we talked about this last lecture with the emergence of Arab nationalism and the political violence that spread throughout the region. You have economic fortunes of so many people decline during this era in the Middle East and in Europe and elsewhere, and it particularly hit hard poor Palestinian farmers, many of whom lost their lands, flooded into cities, and suddenly we're facing problems with landlessness and poverty. There was a lot of mass anger here, and on top of that, the British were losing control of the situation. Right, their power was weakening throughout the world. And the matter was made even worse because this is when the Holocaust is going to start, right? 1933, the Nazis come into power, and what's going to happen is Jews are going to start to flee from Europe. And their numbers escalate and increases. What starts off as a massive problem becomes a state of emergency, right? So these people are desperate, right? They're desperate for a place to go. And on top of that, the Palestinians are desperate. They're losing their land here. And so what happens is the anti-Semitism grows, the Islamophobia grows amongst both these communities. We start to see this growing hatred, and communal violence increases, terrorism increases, political violence. We start to see mob riots take place. And so what starts to happen is both sides start to form their organized militias, okay? So the Palestinians form something called the Arab Hire Committee, mobilizing, okay, volunteers to go and fight for Palestine, to prevent more migration. And they engage in a mass revolt against Zionists and the British starting in 1936. The union activists organized mass strikes. There was also as well political violence committed against these Jewish settlers and British targets. And for their part, the Israelis formed their own militia called the Haganah. And this militia was initially started to protect Israeli communities and then was used to attack Arab communities. And a lot of violence took place. Acts of terrorism were committed by Jewish settlers as well. And so the British, they at first did help the Jews put down the revolt. They helped they helped the Jews put down this Arab revolt in 1937. Most of the violence had subsided, although some violence would continue up until 1939. And now the British, though, they didn't want to completely alienate the Palestinians. To try to ease the situation, in 1939, the British announced what is called the White Paper. They promised to reduce Jewish migration. And they also promise as well to the Palestinians that there's not going to be a separate Israeli state. There's only going to be a single Palestinian state. This is another big promise that the British are going to break here, right? So along with Sikes-Picot, the Balfour Declaration, San Marino, they're not going to follow. I mean, this is going to be seen like a slap in the face because what's going to happen is this is not going to happen. After World War II, the British are going to lose control of this colony. They're going to leave it to the United Nations to decide what happens to Palestine, and two states are going to be declared by 1948. So this violence was intense, and of course, part of it was over land and economics, but we can't neglect the religious issue here, right? Of course, this matters, right? And well, like one of these riots took place in 1929 was at the Wailing Wall. If you remember from a couple lectures back, we talked about how Jerusalem has holy monuments for Jews and Muslims. The Wailing Wall is the last wall of King Solomon's temple that stands. Jews go there to weep for their fallen temple. But on top of that temple mount is Al-Aqsa Mosque in the Dome of the Rock, the place where Muslims believe Muhammad made a night journey from the holy city of Mecca to Jerusalem to heaven. It's a sacred spot for Muslims as well. And so there's been constant disputes between these communities over who should control this monument. In 1929, there were riots at this site. You can see they're located right on top of each other. I've been there before. It is an intense environment. It's one of the most militarized historical sites I've ever seen. It's just, I mean, it's a beautiful area, but it's also kind of sad. It's a bit depressing. because, you would hope that a holy religious site like this would be a center of toleration and peace, but right now it's just a center of so much violence and conflict and hatred. And, as you're going to see in the next couple of lectures, since that time period, the Palestinians have borne the brunt in terms of the loss of land and human life. But we do got to keep in mind as well that, this wouldn't have happened without the mass violence committed against Jews in Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, without the Holocaust, right? So that's tied into this history as well. And I think that this is what's hardened so many Israeli attitudes towards outsiders. It's what's made their nationalism so virulent and so aggressive and so defensive in nature, right? So it's just, this is a long, brutal, and complicated history here. And I don't want to simplify it. There's just been a lot of tragedy on both sides. And recently, as I said, we've had over 100,000 Gazans killed, right? So this is still an ongoing conflict. All right, so we're going to continue discussing this in future lectures. So, I'll see you guys next time. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to just send a message in the comments below. I will answer. Of course, fact check me if you felt anything's wrong about this lecture. That's what the scientific process is all about, right? So I'm not a purveyor of absolute truth here, but I am trying to bring a greater understanding of these conflicts to the wider public. That is most importantly my students. All right, so have a great day, and I will see you next lecture if you decide to join me.